what can happen is a new attorney general can bring charges against a former attorney general. And so what you might see is that an attorney general under Trump, if they refuse to produce these documents in compliance with the law, which would be ironic because the attorney general is the chief law enforcement officer of the land, but if they refuse to produce these materials, then let's say whoever is the next president, their attorney general could bring charges because the statute of limitations will not have run out on noncompliance with this law. It's unique. It's different than if there were a subpoena and Congress had referred the person in noncompliance with the subpoena for contempt to, and who do they refer it to? To the DOJ. And so that's why you can never get to the bottom of these cases.
So you just watched that clip, and here's what you should be feeling right now. This volcanic rage building in your chest, because what Massie just described is the architectural schematic of institutional rot, the blueprint for how power protects power, even when that power has been deployed to sexually traffic children to the most powerful men on the planet. Rep. Ro Khanna warned that a future president could charge DOJ officials who don't comply with the law, and what we're witnessing in real time is the complete breakdown of accountability mechanisms in the most powerful law enforcement apparatus in human history. And you need to understand that the law requires DOJ to make the files public by Dec 1919, and yet we stand here in December 2024 watching a legislative chess match where the pieces are child rape survivors, and the board is the rotting corpse of American democracy. But wait, because this is where it gets absolutely insane. The kind of bombshell that should be shattering windows across Capitol Hill. The Attorney General has a 30-day deadline following enactment to release the documents, meaning that the act requires them to be released by December 19, 2025, and what Massie is explaining with surgical precision is that the Department of Justice has erected this impenetrable fortress around its own corruption by creating a system where Congress issues subpoenas. Those subpoenas get referred for contempt to the very same DOJ being investigated, and then shockingly, miraculously, nothing ever happens. It's the snake eating its own tail, except the snake is protecting pedophiles, and the tail is the American people's faith in justice itself. The bipartisan fury here is palpable, visceral, and if you're paying attention, you can feel the tectonic plates of political discourse shifting beneath your feet, because this isn't about partisan games anymore. This is about whether the billionaire class gets to rape children with absolute impunity while the rest of us watch our healthcare evaporate and our wages stagnate and our planet burn. And here's where the history becomes essential, where we need to trace the genealogy of elite criminality back through decades of carefully constructed immunity. Survivors of Epstein's abuse believe the government has kept hidden the full extent of what it knows about his activities and who was involved. And what we're seeing is the culmination of a multi-decade project to insulate wealth from consequence, to create a separate legal system for those who summer in the Hamptons and winter in Aspen, while the rest of us face prosecution for possession of a plant or failure to appear at a traffic hearing. The Epstein case represents something far more profound than one monstrous financier. It's the aperture through which we can glimpse the entire architecture of power in late-stage capitalism, where sexual violence becomes another commodity, where teenage girls become inventory, where private islands become jurisdictions unto themselves beyond the reach of law or morality, or basic human decency. During the presidency of Joe Biden from 2021 to 2025, many right-wing figures hypothesized the existence of a list of Epstein's clients not disclosed by the Biden administration, and Kash Patel stated that the FBI was withholding information on Epstein, and now we need to talk about the stunning betrayal that has characterized the Trump administration's handling of these files, because this is where the ideological consistency of the left becomes our greatest strength. We on the progressive side have maintained an unwavering commitment to transparency and accountability regardless of whose names appear in those documents, whether they implicate Clinton or Trump or academic luminaries or tech billionaires or Hollywood power brokers, because our North Star has always been justice for survivors and the dismantling of systems that enable predation. A September 2025 Marist poll found that 90% of Americans wanted at least some of the Epstein files released with victims' names redacted, with 77% wanting all files released, and 84% of Democrats, 67% of Republicans, and 83% of independents wanting all files released. This overwhelming consensus tells you everything you need to know about how thoroughly the public understands that the game is rigged, that there are two Americas, one where you face life imprisonment for selling loose cigarettes, and another where you can orchestrate an international child sex trafficking operation and die under circumstances so suspicious that many believe that Epstein, whose death was ruled a suicide, was murdered to prevent his powerful associates from being implicated. And whether or not that conspiracy theory holds water is almost beside the point, because the underlying truth it gestures toward is irrefutable, that powerful men have committed horrific acts against vulnerable girls and have faced no meaningful consequences, that the institutions tasked with protecting children have instead protected predators, that the Department of Justice has become the Department of Obstruction. But here comes the absolutely critical twist that should make your blood pressure spike. Trump pledged to release the Epstein files during his 2024 campaign, stated he would have no problem releasing additional files and would probably make the client list public, and then signed the Epstein Files Transparency Act, and yet Bondi released a statement saying the DOJ found no incriminating client list. The DOJ and FBI announced that no further files would be released, and Bondi's statement drew outrage from conservative figures, including Liz Wheeler, calling it unforgivable behavior. This is the moment where the masks slip off completely, where campaign promises dissolve like sugar in acid, where the populist rhetoric about draining swamps reveals itself as performative theater, designed to channel legitimate rage into electoral support, while the fundamental structures of elite impunity remain not just intact but fortified. Republican Representative Thomas Massie suggested the investigation may be a smokescreen and a last-ditch effort to prevent the release of the Epstein files, and what we're witnessing is something that should radicalize every single person who believes in the possibility of justice under law. Former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuade stated that the announcement appears to be a strategic effort to block the release of further documents in the Epstein case, because if there is a pending investigation, the DOJ can assert executive privilege and try to prevent any more documents from being released. This is the machinery of institutional protection operating at maximum capacity, deploying every tool in the arsenal to shield the powerful from scrutiny, and what makes it so particularly galling is the bipartisan nature of this protection racket. Because let's be absolutely crystal clear about the political economy of elite pedophilia, about how this maps onto larger structures of exploitation and domination. There is a billionaire class that treats the majority of humanity as undeserving of basic rights. To them we are replaceable, low-value assets that can be abused, worked to death, deprived of our liberty, denied health care, and disposed of at will. The same logic that allows Jeff Bezos to extract surplus value from workers urinating in bottles to meet impossible quotas is the logic that allowed Jeffrey Epstein to traffic teenage girls to princes and presidents and professors. It's the logic of commodification taken to its most depraved extreme, where even human bodies, even children's bodies, become resources to be exploited by those with sufficient capital and connections. And this is where the institutional analysis becomes absolutely essential, because we need to understand how the Department of Justice has been systematically hollowed out, captured by the very interests it's supposed to regulate. A department with broken internal accountability systems cannot be expected to police itself against personal and partisan misuse of its authorities, and what we've seen over the past several decades is the deliberate erosion of institutional independence, the replacement of career prosecutors committed to rule of law with political operatives committed to partisan protection, the transformation of the Justice Department from a check on executive power to a tool of executive impunity. Hundreds of attorneys have left DOJ, taking with them institutional knowledge and expectations of how DOJ attorneys should serve the country, and their replacements are entering a department with leadership that expressly prioritizes adherence to the Trump administration's political agenda. This institutional collapse didn't happen by accident. It's the result of a coordinated campaign by conservative legal theorists and their billionaire backers to reconstruct the entire federal judiciary and prosecutorial apparatus as an instrument of oligarchic power. And nowhere is this more visible than in how the Trump administration has handled the Epstein files. The Trump administration pledged full transparency of the Epstein files, but delays in their release and the president's playing down of their significance has frustrated some of his supporters, who suspect a cover-up, and yet Trump defended Bondi and referred to Epstein as somebody that nobody cares about, and later referred to the Epstein files as a big hoax. The whiplash here should give you vertigo, the way populist posturing transforms seamlessly into establishment protection, the way promises of accountability evaporate the moment they threaten to implicate the actual power structure. But let me tell you what happens next in this sordid saga, because Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez posted that House Republicans suddenly canceled congressional session Friday and are sending everyone home Thursday evening, the same day Epstein files are supposed to be released on Friday. The optics here are so damning that they border on parody, like watching a criminal return to the scene of the crime carrying a smoking gun and a signed confession. Hakeem Jeffries said, In the context of this Jeffrey Epstein scandal, and their refusal to share information to the American people despite promising to do so, one must ponder the question, what are they hiding from the American people, and what billionaires, what well-connected donors, what elite people are they trying to protect? And concluded, it's reasonable to conclude that Republicans are continuing to protect the lifestyles of the rich and shameless, even if that includes pedophiles. This is the moment where bipartisan rage crystallizes into something approaching class consciousness, where people across the political spectrum begin to recognize that the fundamental divide in American society isn't between red and blue, but between those who are subject to law and those who are above it, between the governed and the governors, between the exploited and the exploiters. Khanna stated, the elements of that are to rail against an elite governing class that has created a system that's not working for ordinary Americans, and attacked the Epstein class that has accumulated power and doesn't play by the rules, and has impunity at the expense of ordinary Americans. This language of elite impunity cuts through the manufactured divisions that keep working people fighting each other instead of fighting the oligarchy that immiserates us all. And we need to sit with the implications of what Massie described in that clip, because he's outlining a genuine solution to institutional paralysis, a mechanism whereby future administrations could actually prosecute officials who violated the law by refusing to comply with transparency requirements. The statute of limitations provides a window of accountability that extends beyond the term of any single administration, which means that even if the Biden DOJ stonewalls, even if Merrick Garland's Justice Department continues its pattern of milquetoast institutionalism and deference to executive power, a future attorney general could bring charges against those officials for their refusal to comply with lawfully mandated disclosure. This is the kind of institutional accountability mechanism that progressives should be championing because it creates consequences for elite lawbreaking. It establishes that no one, not even the Attorney General of the United States, is above the law. But here's where we need to be ruthlessly honest about the limitations of legalistic solutions to fundamentally political problems. This case could expose the bipartisan architecture of elite impunity and the culture of complicity that sustains it. And what we're really confronting is not a failure of laws or procedures, but a success of power in protecting itself. The system is working exactly as designed when it insulates Jeffrey Epstein's co-conspirators from accountability, when it allows princes and presidents to fly to private islands and abuse children and then return to their positions of wealth and influence without consequence. This isn't a bug, it's the central feature of how power operates in a society structured by massive inequality, where capital concentration produces political capture, produces legal immunity, produces further capital concentration in an accelerating cycle of oligarchic consolidation. And this takes us to the heart of why the Epstein case matters so profoundly for progressive politics, why it can't be dismissed as a distraction from more important issues of economic justice or climate catastrophe or imperial violence. This case could expose the bipartisan architecture of elite impunity and the culture of complicity that sustains it, and to wave off every horror as a distraction is to participate in the very obfuscation that protects the powerful. The sexual trafficking of children by the ultra-wealthy is not separate from the theft of wages from workers, or the poisoning of water supplies by chemical companies, or the funding of genocides by defense contractors. These are all manifestations of the same fundamental relation, the subordination of human life to the accumulation of private profit, the treatment of people as things to be used and discarded. What Massie is describing in that clip is a rare moment of clarity about how institutional decay produces impunity, about how the Department of Justice has become precisely the kind of self-protecting bureaucracy that conservatives always claim to fear, while progressives warned about regulatory capture. The congressional subpoena process is toothless when the institution being investigated is the same institution tasked with enforcing contempt citations. It's like asking the mafia to investigate itself for racketeering and being shocked when the investigation goes nowhere. This is why the mechanism Massie describes matters, because it short-circuits that self-protective loop. It creates accountability from outside the corrupt institution, rather than relying on the institution to police itself. But we also need to reckon with why Trump's administration, supposedly committed to draining swamps and exposing deep state corruption, has worked so assiduously to suppress these files. Donald Trump is mentioned over 1,000 times in various tranches of the files, largely detailing a social relationship in Palm Beach during the 1990s and early 2000s, and flight logs confirm Trump flew with Epstein at least 7 times in the mid-90s, and while most were mentioned in passing and not accused of any wrongdoing, the fact remains that Epstein says in one 2019 email that Trump knew about the girls. The personal investment Trump has in suppressing these files doesn't exonerate the bipartisan establishment that also has names to protect, but it does reveal the hollow core of right-wing populism, the way it channels legitimate rage at elite corruption into support for a different set of elites who are just as committed to protecting their class interests. This is the dialectical tension that progressives need to navigate. The fact that there is real bipartisan outrage at elite pedophilia, that working-class Trump voters and Bernie supporters alike are furious about two-tiered justice systems, and yet that outrage keeps getting captured by demagogues who promise accountability while delivering more of the same. The discharge petition received the minimum required 218 signatures needed from 4 Republican representatives and 214 Democratic Party representatives, forcing a House vote on the bill, which tells you that the Democratic caucus was essentially unanimous in supporting transparency, while Republican leadership worked actively to suppress the vote. Trump and top White House officials began burning up the phone lines and whipping on the fence Republicans to ensure they didn't sign the discharge petitions, because the moment transparency threatens to implicate Trump himself, all the populist rhetoric about exposing elites evaporates like morning dew. And we should spend a moment appreciating the bitter irony that Pam Bondi was confirmed by the U.S. Senate in a 54-46 vote on February 4, 2025, as United States Attorney General, and has now become the face of this cover-up, this loyal Trump operative who stated, "The Department of Justice, the prosecutors will be prosecuted, the bad ones, the investigators will be investigated, because the deep state last term for President Trump, they were hiding in the shadows, and yet when it comes time to actually investigate and prosecute the powerful, suddenly the files can't be released, suddenly there's no client list, suddenly the whole thing is a hoax." The doublethink required to maintain this position should cause severe cognitive dissonance, but we're living in an era where ideological consistency matters less than tribal loyalty, where political positions are adopted not because they're coherent, but because they signal allegiance to Team Red or Team Blue. This is precisely why progressive analysis needs to remain rooted in material conditions and structural critique rather than personality-driven narratives. The problem isn't that Trump is uniquely corrupt or that Bondi is uniquely dishonest, though both are certainly those things. The problem is that we have constructed a political economy that produces these people like a factory produces widgets, that selects for sociopathy and rewards it with power, that elevates those most willing to sacrifice principle for advantage. Jeffrey Epstein wasn't an aberration. He was a perfect expression of what happens when you combine obscene wealth concentration with patriarchal violence, with neoliberal commodification, with the complete collapse of solidarity and collective care. And here's where we need to connect this back to the broader crisis of accountability in American institutions, because the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York was running an active investigation into Epstein and Maxwell's co-conspirators until January 2025, when prosecutors were directed to transfer the Epstein case files to DOJ headquarters, and the investigation into co-conspirators has inexplicably ceased. This is institutional corruption operating in broad daylight, the deliberate termination of ongoing investigations that threatened to implicate powerful interests, and it happened under an administration that promised to expose exactly this kind of corruption. The Southern District of New York has a reputation for institutional independence, for going after powerful defendants regardless of political connections, and the fact that the Trump DOJ shut down that investigation tells you everything about whose interests are actually being served. Bondi and Patel promoted conspiracy theories surrounding Epstein, claiming the government was concealing files to shield powerful elites from criminal charges, and those placements led to expectations among the MAGA faithful that releasing Epstein records would be a top priority of Trump's second term, and instead the DOJ released an unsigned memo refuting all damning theories, stating Epstein had no client list, nor is there evidence he tried to blackmail powerful figures. The bait and switch here is so brazen that it would be funny if it weren't so devastating to survivors, if it didn't represent the final foreclosure of accountability, the official declaration that elite crimes will not be prosecuted no matter how much evidence exists, no matter how many victims come forward, no matter how loud the public demands for justice. But wait, because there's still one more bombshell to detonate here, one more layer of institutional rot to expose. Photos released show Epstein with left-wing linguist and dissident Noam Chomsky, filmmaker Woody Allen, and New York Times columnist David Brooks, which should remind us that elite impunity is truly bipartisan, that these networks of power and predation cross ideological lines, that being photographed with Epstein doesn't prove criminality, but does demonstrate proximity to power, participation in those same rarefied circles where billionaires and intellectuals and celebrities mingle. The fact that Chomsky appears in these photos doesn't invalidate his decades of anti-imperialist scholarship, but it should prompt serious questions about how even the most trenchant critics of power can be absorbed into its social networks, can be compromised by their proximity to wealth and influence. This is the insidious nature of elite capture, the way that even those who position themselves as dissidents and critics can find themselves entangled with the very systems they claim to oppose, and it's why we need structures of accountability that apply universally rather than selectively, that investigate crimes rather than protecting powerful friends. Khanna believes the files will show in certain cases how powerful men said that they had control over the local police in New York, or had contacts with the FBI and told survivors not to report things, and stated it needs to come out, who the other powerful men were on Epstein's rape island. This is what transparency looks like, the willingness to follow evidence wherever it leads regardless of whose reputation might be damaged, and it's precisely what the bipartisan establishment refuses to permit, because too many powerful people on both sides of the aisle have too much to lose. And ultimately what Massie is describing in that clip is a potential mechanism for breaking through institutional paralysis, for creating consequences that outlast any single administration's stonewalling, for ensuring that officials who violate transparency laws face prosecution even years after they leave office. The statute of limitations becomes a sword of Damocles, hanging over the heads of those who would suppress evidence of elite criminality, a reminder that accountability might be delayed, but not necessarily denied. This is the kind of creative institutional thinking that progressives should be championing, the recognition that sometimes you need to build new accountability mechanisms when existing ones have been captured and corrupted beyond repair. But we also can't be naive about the limitations of legal solutions to political problems, about the fact that even if a future attorney general brings charges against Biden DOJ officials for failing to release the Epstein files, even if some mid-level bureaucrat faces prosecution, the fundamental architecture of elite impunity remains intact, as long as we tolerate obscene concentrations of wealth and power. You cannot have both democracy and oligarchy. You cannot have both justice and billionaires. You cannot have both accountability and a system where capital accumulation trumps all other values. The Epstein case is a symptom of a much deeper disease, the disease of capitalism in its terminal phase, where every human relation has been commodified, where even children become inventory in a ledger of exploitation. This is why the bipartisan rage around these files matters so much, why it represents a potential opening for building class consciousness and solidarity across manufactured partisan divides. A September 2025 Marist poll found that 90% of Americans wanted at least some files released with victims' names redacted, with 77% wanting all files released, which represents the kind of overwhelming consensus that should be forcing political action, and yet the bipartisan establishment in Washington has worked in concert to suppress that consensus, to protect their own interests against the democratic will of the people they supposedly represent. This is oligarchy wearing the mask of democracy. This is manufactured consent in its most transparent form, and it should radicalize anyone who still believes in the possibility of self-governance. So here's what we do with this information. Here's how we translate rage into resistance, how we build a movement capable of tearing down these structures of impunity and constructing something better in their place. We refuse to let this story die. We keep demanding transparency. We support survivors who come forward. We name names and follow money, and expose connections between billionaire predators and the politicians who protect them. We recognize that the fight for economic justice, and the fight against sexual violence, and the fight for democratic accountability are all the same fight, all manifestations of the struggle against oligarchic power. We build coalitions across partisan lines around the recognition that elite impunity is the enemy, that working people have more in common with each other than any of us have with the ruling class regardless of their party affiliation. And we remember always that what Massie described in that clip, the mechanism whereby future attorneys general could prosecute officials who violated transparency laws, only matters if we elect people committed to actually using that power, committed to following evidence rather than protecting elites, committed to justice rather than careerism. The institutions won't reform themselves, the oligarchs won't voluntarily relinquish power, the Department of Injustice won't suddenly discover its conscience. Change comes from below, from organized movements of ordinary people demanding accountability and refusing to accept excuses. The Epstein files should be released in their entirety, with victims' identities protected. Every name should be investigated regardless of political affiliation or social standing, and anyone who enabled or participated in the sexual trafficking of children should face prosecution to the fullest extent of law. Anything less is complicity in the architecture of elite impunity that Massie so perfectly diagnosed. Anything less is an admission that we have abandoned even the pretense of equal justice under law. Anything less is surrender to the billionaire pedophile class that treats human beings as commodities to be consumed and discarded. This is the fight, this is the moment, and we either rise to meet it, or we watch as the last remnants of accountability dissolve into the acid bath of oligarchic corruption. Choose accordingly.